Alrighty, so we're going to jump into this would be, I guess, part three of Unit 1. And so, we've looked at, in part one, we looked at the differences between like political and economic systems. And in part two, we did a little bit about entrepreneurs and the free market. Part three, we're going to talk about another key component with this, which is labor. So, labor are your workers. Labor is the single biggest expense that any business will have. Um, and labor in America has a very long and sort of detailed and complex history in American society. To begin with, um, let's just sort of back off and go with this. There were legitimate reasons why American workers were very, very unhappy in the 19th century. Many of them were incredibly abused and taken advantage of. They were the victims of exceedingly low wages. Sometimes we're talking about people were making 10 cents a day. Even at a time when things were much less expensive and money went a lot farther. When it takes like an entire day's pay to buy a couple of loaves of bread, that's still pretty low. Um, Horrible working conditions. It was unsafe. The environments were unsanitary. They were disgusting. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on when we get to the progressive era of American politics. But working conditions were exceedingly poor, and workers could be easily replaced if they injured themselves or, God forbid, died. Long hours. It was not uncommon to be working 6 days a week, anywhere from 10 to 14 hours a day. Sometimes more if things were desperate or they needed a lot of stuff going on. So, a 60 to 90-hour work week was not uncommon. It was also not uncommon for children as young as 5 to be working in various and sundry jobs, in factories, in mines, in agriculture. The child mortality rate was exceptionally high among the poor lower classes. Now, all of these conditions are horrible, and the extremes of these situations led to left-wing anarchists, social anarchists, socialists, in seeing an opportunity in both Europe and America where this new industrialization had brought about these situations. I don't know how they grab that, but why is this thing moving? I don't know. It's really frustrating. Put this down here, make it go away. Um, all of these situations had led to an opportunity in both Europe and America for anarchists to sort of wheedle their way into the working class. And anarchists, especially in Europe, began to either start unions or to join them. So, what is a union? A union is simply a group of workers who are involved in the same job, who join together with the idea that as a group, they can negotiate better than they could on their own. These anarchists would exploit legitimate problems that workers were dealing with. I mean, I need to be very clear. The problems, to borrow the really stupid phrase, the struggle is real. It was. These were real, legit problems. But the solution of dealing with them through, like, socialism really wasn't going to help anybody. But people were so desperate for something, for change, for some kind of win, that they were willing to go along with these political extremists. And as a result, unions began to become very socialist. In 1848, the anarchists, the socialists, and this is around the same time as the publication of the Communist Manifesto from Karl Marx, convinced many Europeans that they needed to rise up in a great proletariat revolution to overthrow the bourgeois. It failed miserably. Um, Now, faced with the real possibility of either A, going to jail, or B, getting executed for the role in these revolutions, many of these socialist leaders of these unions escaped to America and began joining American unions or starting unions in America. And this led in the 1850s and 1860s to a whole bunch of problems. Probably the culmination of which, or the most visible of these problems, was the Great Draft Riot of 1863 during the Civil War, when the North was attempting to get more soldiers by instituting a large-scale military draft. Now, the draft itself is not really what caused the problems. The problem is that, you know, obviously a lot of people don't want to end up going into a war. So in the North, if you were rich enough, if you had enough money, you could buy your way out of the draft by hiring somebody to go to war for you. And this really impacted the poor classes, specifically the immigrant poor, who were being paid maybe a year's salary, and all they had to do was sign up for the army. Well, these socialists really push this idea that this is an example of this struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat. And there were these massive riots that, for 3 days, the city of New York basically was shut down, until the mayor of New York was able to convince the Archbishop of New York City to, I think his name was John England, to speak to the workers who were revolting, because most of them were actually Irish or Italian, and being Catholic, the church had a lot of influence at that time. And the Bishop of New York got them to stop the riots, but it was bad. And all of this was really the activity of anarchists and socialist anarchists, riling people up and getting them worked up into a tizzy and just like going nuts over stuff. Legitimate issues, but the response probably not the best. So where does sort of all this sort of come from? So let's start with this. Again, a union is simply a group of workers in the same business who join together in an effort to negotiate for better pay, better working conditions, better hours, whatever you want. Unions had their origin in an old system from Europe called the guild system, where you had specialized craftsmen who joined together, and they would basically only do jobs that were chartered through their guild organization. And this really was the beginning of the middle class in Europe. And these specialized, well-trained laborers made more money than other workers did. And they had a lot more control over jobs that they took or didn't take. And they generally put themselves in a better position, not only financially, but politically, because of their expertise. This idea eventually trickled down to the concept that you could have workers in any business or industry join together. But this idea of these worker groups really wasn't well regarded, especially like unskilled worker groups. The real first big win for American labor was in 1842 in a court case called the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Hunt, where it was determined that unions could form if they were legally chartered through a contract with the state and they did not do illegal things to get what they wanted. So, as long as you engaged in your First Amendment rights of peaceful protest and redress of grievances, and you had legal documentation setting up your organization as a chartered group recognized through the state, they were allowed to exist. And 1842 really is where the big union movement in America starts up. Now, there was a lot of tension between workers and owners or management. Americans are naturally very individualistic. We tend to be loners to some degree. We look at ourselves as being different than other people. We don't need other people. And this idea of workers joining together in groups, especially at a time when there were really not many big cities, was really not very American. And Americans in general were very suspicious of this. Now, part of the problem is that this is around the same time period that stories began to come to America of a group known as the Illuminati. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard the term Illuminati before, so let's kind of dig briefly into what this is. In 1875, a former Catholic priest named Adam Weishaupt, he was Bavarian, it's a German group, started a group of, it was essentially a secret society or a cult made up of very wealthy, very well-educated Bavarian German noblemen with the goal of establishing a brand new religion and a brand new system of government where the super well-educated, wealthy elite would be in charge of everything, and that there would be one religion that was incorporated beliefs of every religion in the world into one standardized format, and there would be eventually one government that would run everybody, controlled by this select group of people. They called themselves the Illuminati, or that means the enlightened ones, or the knowledge, the ones with knowledge. And they were largely involved in the situation that became the French Revolution. The situation in France was ripe for political unrest, and many younger French aristocrats were sympathetic with these Illuminati ideas. They blamed the French church for the problems. Louis XVI's very poor ruling and Marie Antoinette's probably overly naive approach to her role as queen did not help matters, as well as famine and, drought. And all of this sort of culminated in this group of people being very influential in stirring up the French to overthrow the king and eventually execute him and establish a French republic. Many of the members of the Committee of the Public Safety were actually members of this Illuminati organization. Now, eventually the French Revolution petered out, and by the 1820s, European governments actively began hunting down anybody that could be proven to be a member of this Illuminati organization, and they were either imprisoned or executed. The ones that were not caught or the ones that were not identified, kind of blended back into society and began doing their ideas through other means. This group are the ones who paid Karl Marx to write his political philosophy, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Um, they the belief is that these Illuminati elite, whoever they were, not only blended into European society again and changed their methods, many of them came to America and began influencing the American labor movement, American government, American business, using similar tactics to what they had had in Europe, with the idea eventually of using American style democracy to move itself gradually towards the creation of this new, what they would term as the new Atlantis, where they would create this government of the educated, wealthy elite and create a new religion and then spread these ideas out from America. These stories and this concept of a very real group of people who had some pretty weird ideas, they got picked up by a lot of people. And the idea began to foster that unions were a part of this great Illuminati conspiracy to overthrow the American government. It didn't help that early unions were very secretive, largely because they were afraid of getting broken up or having people come into them who were going to try to wipe them out because they were making things difficult for businesses. Owners of businesses really fed into this paranoia, and they really pushed this idea that labor in America was part of a giant anarchist conspiracy connected with Marxism, socialism, and the Illuminati. And that by addressing any of the legitimate concerns that labor had, whether that was child labor, whether that was unsafe working conditions, whether that was exceedingly low wages, whether that was unsafe environments, whatever the condition may be, long hours, by addressing any of these problems, you are actually giving in to these Illuminati anarchists. And every single instance of worker pushback against injustice was reframed by ownership as being part of the great conspiracy to overthrow America. The ironic part about this is that the more that owners did this, the more that people began to think that maybe the socialists were right and that it was all about class struggle. It's all about critical theory again, this idea that all of history is a struggle between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and the poor, the bourgeois and the proletariat. In Europe, it didn't help that all the big unions were run by Marxists. And these immigrants that came to America after the revolutions of 1848 failed, they were political immigrants. They did not come to America with the idea of starting over and making a new life and living the American dream. They came to America with the idea of remaking America in their image, of changing what America was to become what they wanted it to be. And this was a very different type of situation for the United States because we had never had these types of immigrants before. And to be fair, and to be very clear about this, it was only a small number of immigrants. And they were primarily German and Northern French immigrants who were like this, and maybe some Irish or English immigrants. But these were the people who really were pushing these ideas of change. It was a small number of people, but it led to the general belief that all labor movements in America were part of this vast conspiracy. And this was a problem that persisted for decades after the revolutions of 1848 in Europe had failed. Okay, we'll pick this up with part 2 or lesson 2 of this part 3 tomorrow. Peace and love.